Margaret Chen had worked at the Riverside restaurant for nearly 30 years, and in all that time she had learned to read people by the way they held their menus or the nervous tap of their fingers against the white tablecloth. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for the afternoon when everything she thought she knew about silence and connection would change forever. The lunch rush had just begun to ease when they walked in, and Margaret noticed them immediately because there was something different about the way the elderly woman moved through the space with such careful attention to everything around her, while the younger man guided her gently with his hand barely touching her elbow. Margaret approached their table, with her order pad already in hand and her practiced smile firmly in place, and she began her usual greeting, but stopped mid-sentence when she noticed that the older woman wasn't looking at her at all, but instead was watching her son's lips with an intensity that made Margaret's heart skip. The man, who looked to be in his early 50s, turned to Margaret and spoke quietly, with a kindness in his eyes that immediately put her at ease, even as his words created a small flutter of panic in her chest. "My mother is deaf," he said, and his voice carried no embarrassment or apology, just a simple statement of fact as natural as commenting on the weather. "And I usually interpret for her, but if you could speak slowly and face her directly, she reads lips beautifully." Margaret felt her face flush warm, and she nodded quickly, but inside her mind was racing, because in all her years of serving customers she had never encountered this situation, and she wasn't sure she knew how to handle it with the grace it deserved. She turned to face the older woman directly and spoke slowly and clearly as instructed, telling them about the daily specials and watching as the woman's face lit up with understanding and appreciation. And when the woman responded, her voice had the distinctive quality of someone who had lost their hearing later in life, clear enough to understand but shaped differently than those who had always heard their own words. The woman's name was Rose, and her son was Daniel, and as Margaret took their order, she found herself drawn into their gentle dynamic, the way Daniel would sign certain words even as he spoke them aloud, and how Rose would reach out occasionally to touch his hand when she needed clarification. Margaret returned to the kitchen with their order and found herself thinking about her own mother, who had passed away 5 years earlier, and how she wished she had been more patient during those final years when her mother's hearing had started to fade, and she had become frustrated by having to repeat things over and over. She delivered their meals with extra care, making sure to face Rose directly when she asked if everything was prepared to their satisfaction, and Rose smiled at her with such warmth that Margaret felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening that she hadn't known was closed. Throughout their meal, Margaret found herself checking on their table more frequently than necessary, and each time she approached, Rose would look up at her with those bright eyes that seemed to see more than most people who could hear everything, and Daniel would smile at her with gratitude that made her feel like she was doing something important, even though she was just serving lunch. When they were nearly finished with their meal, Margaret noticed a young couple at the next table making faces and whispering to each other, and at first she didn't understand what had caught their attention. But then she heard Rose's voice raised slightly, louder than necessary, as she told Daniel a story about her garden and the vegetables that were finally coming in after a long spring. The young woman at the next table rolled her eyes dramatically and said something to her companion that Margaret couldn't quite hear, but she saw him laugh and she felt anger rise up in her throat, hot and sudden and protective. Before she could think about what she was doing, Margaret walked over to their table and spoke in a voice that was still professional, but carried an edge that surprised even her, and she told them that if they had concerns about other guests, they were welcome to request a different table, but that all patrons of the restaurant deserved respect and courtesy regardless of their circumstances. The young couple looked startled and somewhat embarrassed, and they mumbled something that might have been an apology before turning their attention back to their own meals with considerably less whispering. And Margaret walked away, feeling her heart pounding but also feeling a fierce satisfaction that she had spoken up. When she returned to Rose and Daniel's table to clear their plates, Daniel caught her eye, and she realized he had witnessed the entire exchange. And there was something in his expression that made her feel simultaneously proud and vulnerable, like she had revealed more of herself than she had intended. "Thank you," he said quietly, and the simplicity of those two words carried more weight than any elaborate praise could have, and Margaret just nodded because she didn't trust her voice to remain steady. As they prepared to leave, Daniel asked to speak with her manager, and Margaret felt a moment of concern, wondering if perhaps she had overstepped her bounds by confronting the other guests. But when her manager approached the table, Daniel spoke warmly about the exceptional service, and specifically about Margaret's patience and kindness toward his mother. Rose took Margaret's hand then and held it between both of hers, and she spoke carefully, forming each word with deliberate precision, and she said that Margaret had made her feel seen and valued, and that such simple kindness was rarer than most people realized. Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes, unexpected and unwelcome, because she was at work and she prided herself on maintaining her professional composure. But there was something about the way Rose looked at her with such genuine appreciation that broke through all her carefully maintained barriers. After they left, Margaret found an envelope on the table with her name written on it in careful handwriting, and inside was not just a generous tip, but also a note that Daniel had written explaining that his mother rarely enjoyed going out to restaurants because so many people treated her as if her deafness made her somehow less than fully present. But that today had been different, and they wanted her to know how much that meant to them. Margaret kept that note in her apron pocket for the rest of her shift and read it during her break and again before she went home that evening. And she found herself thinking about all the ways she had failed to really see the customers who passed through her section every day, treating them as orders to take and meals to deliver, rather than as whole people with their own stories and struggles. The next week, when Rose and Daniel returned, Margaret was ready, and she had spent time watching videos online about basic sign language, and she had learned a few simple phrases, and when they sat down, she signed hello to Rose with fingers that trembled slightly from nervousness and uncertainty. Rose's face transformed with such joy that Margaret knew immediately that her efforts, however clumsy, had been worthwhile, and Daniel looked at her with surprise and something else that might have been admiration, and he helped her with her hand positions, gently adjusting her fingers and showing her the proper movement. They began coming in every week, always on Tuesday afternoons when the restaurant was quieter, and Margaret found herself looking forward to their visits with an anticipation that had nothing to do with tips or professional obligation, and everything to do with the genuine connection that was forming between them. Rose taught her more signs during their visits, and Margaret practiced at home using online tutorials and mirrors, trying to perfect the fluid movements that seemed to come so naturally to Daniel, and sometimes she would mess up entirely, and they would all laugh together at her mistakes, and Rose would patiently show her again how to form the words correctly. Margaret learned that Rose had lost her hearing gradually over the course of several years due to a degenerative condition, and that she had struggled initially with the isolation that came with that loss, but that Daniel had learned sign language alongside her and had made sure she never felt alone in her silent world. She learned that Daniel ran a successful consulting business, but that he always made time to have lunch with his mother every Tuesday without fail, and that this routine had become sacred to both of them. And Margaret felt honored to be included even peripherally in this weekly ritual of love and devotion. One Tuesday afternoon, Rose didn't come, and Daniel arrived alone with a tired expression that spoke of sleepless nights and worry, and he explained that his mother had been ill with pneumonia and was in the hospital recovering, and Margaret felt her heart constrict with concern for this woman who had become so important to her in such a short time. She asked if she could visit, and Daniel looked surprised but pleased, and he wrote down the hospital information and told her that his mother would be delighted to see her, and Margaret finished her shift and drove straight to the hospital, still wearing her work uniform, because she didn't want to wait even long enough to go home and change. Rose was sitting up in bed when Margaret arrived, looking smaller somehow in the hospital gown and without her usual jewelry and carefully styled hair, but her smile was as bright as ever when she saw Margaret in the doorway, and she signed hello with hands that looked frail against the white sheets. Margaret sat beside her bed and signed back with more confidence than she had felt those first few weeks, and they communicated in a mixture